Well, hi everybody. We're obviously I'm out today, but we're gonna still try to do everything as normal so that the classes do not fall behind the other classes in the grade level. So today is Thursday, October 21st. On our agenda today, we're gonna do our warm up just like usual, and we'll talk about the Constitutional Convention. So the word Constitution is in there. So now it's time to write the Constitution that we've been talking about. That's going to replace the weak Articles of Confederation. So on your desk right now, you should have your interactive notebook. You should have a highlighter because there'll be things I'm going to ask you to highlight. And there were 3 pages that you should have grabbed that should be in your interactive notebook in order. And the way that you'll know when they're in the correct order is the first one doesn't have a page number, has a larger title. And then the second and third one actually say page 2 and page 3 at the top. So this might be a good time to pause and give you a moment to do that. All right, for our warm up today, it is a throwback Thursday. So we're going to look at some old concepts. So for today, you're going to draw a simple map of the British colonial regions. So instead of drawing the entire map at the correct shape, just go ahead and draw what you see on your screen. New England, Middle, Southern. So we're looking at the regions. And then in a second, I'm going to show you some characteristics that you're going to place in the correct region. So you want to give yourself space to write a few things inside of it. All right, so here are some things that you're going to place in those boxes. Breadbasket colonies, plantations, most religious diversity, meaning the most mixture of different religions, dense forests, moderate climate, meaning not too hot, not too cold, rocky soil, most fertile soil, natural deep harbors. This may be a good time to pause the video while students place these in the correct spot. All right, so let's go ahead and go over it. Hopefully, the video was paused and you had enough time to put them in there. So let's take a look what would fit in the New England colonies. You should have dense forests, the rocky soil, natural deep harbors. For the middle colonies, you should have breadbasket colonies, most religious diversity. So most of the people of different Christian faiths lived in the middle colonies, and a moderate climate. And in the southern region, plantations and the most fertile soil. So differences in geography definitely impacted the economic activities. All right, so we're going to start into our topic today. So today you're going to be filling in your notes just like normal. This is more of an instruction for the teacher in the classroom. There may be times that you want to pause it to give kids a chance to copy the information. I will post it online so that you can see it if you miss anything that you see on the screen. So today, our topic is the Constitutional Convention and compromises. So on your note sheet at the very top of the first page, you have this timeline. Everything from the Declaration of Independence to the Bill of Rights being added to our Constitution. And so I'm going to put a few things on the screen that I'm going to ask you to copy down on your copy. So you may want to go ahead and write them and then highlight them. It'll give you an idea of what the big events happening during that time were. So during the period between 1776 and 1781 was the American Revolution, the fight for independence. When the Articles of Confederation are introduced, we would call that a weak government. The era between 1781 and 1787 we would call the critical period. Critical because the United States was on life support with a weak government. When we get to 1787, we will say goodbye to the Articles of Confederation and we will say hello to the US Constitution. So please make sure that you have copied these down on the timeline. And so if you're wondering where are we in history, today we are right here. We're going to be looking at this event. So let's start off with a little review of the events that led up to the American Revolution, not to the American Revolution, that led up to the Constitutional Convention. And you're going to see a familiar event from yesterday, Shays' Rebellion, which showed us how weak our government was. So in your notes, you will see a section called Video Notes. Go ahead and write down at least 2 items that you can pull from the short segment of video. It's only about 2.5 minutes.
In the fall of 1786, angry mobs of farmers, led by the Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays, went on the march through Massachusetts, protesting high taxes, closing courthouses, and threatening the armory in Springfield. Ultimately, Shays' rebellion was brought to a bloody halt, but the fear of further uprisings convinced Congress that action was needed. They called for a national convention to be held in Philadelphia in 1787. There are combustibles in every state which a spark may set fire to, Washington exclaimed. He agreed to attend the convention, concluding that reform of the present system is indispensable. He would wager his hard-earned reputation on the hope that the convention would succeed, not in revising the Articles of Confederation, but in drafting a new constitution that would create a truly national government. Throughout May 1787, delegates from all over the Union arrived in Philadelphia. Luminaries like Benjamin Franklin and rising stars like Alexander Hamilton were in attendance. There were 7 former governors, including Virginia's Edmund Randolph, and jurists like Pennsylvania's James Wilson. And there were relative newcomers like James Madison. Eventually, 55 men would serve at the convention. And chairing this body, George Washington. Together, they had won the war. Now, they needed to secure the peace. Foreign powers had predicted the American experiment would fail. This convention sought to prove the world wrong. The delegates agreed that they would write a new constitution. It was risky. They were only authorized by Congress to suggest amendments to the existing Articles of Confederation. To proceed, they would work in secret. Windows were shuttered despite the summer heat, and oaths of secrecy were taken. It was thanks to James Madison's diligent note-taking that we even know what took place.
All right, so let me go ahead and fix this and go to full screen. So you saw some items in that segment of the video, and the big idea that you saw was that Shays' Rebellion proved that they had to create a new form of government. And so let's go through the notes and fill in some parts. So the Constitutional Convention. In May 1787, representatives from the states met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. So anything you see in yellow is going to be something that you write down. The representatives quickly agreed on throwing out the Articles of Confederation and writing a new national constitution. So originally they had thought that they would just fix the Articles of Confederation, but they threw it out to create the new constitution. So some facts about this convention. The meeting place was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And that building on the lower right corner is a place that is now called Independence Hall. The major people that were there, sometimes we call them the founding fathers because they founded our nation. Sometimes people call them framers. That has shown up on some tests before, and people think it's the word farmers. It's framers. Just like a framer on a house is built, uses builds the wooden frame that's the structure of the house. So these men were the major figures. People like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, who was the head of the convention, and Alexander Hamilton, who we're going to learn a lot more in the near future. But probably the most famous and the person that contributed the most was James Madison. And so you have something that you're going to write down here. Here are some of his contributions. He wrote down very detailed notes about what happened in that room. And you heard that they closed the curtains. They swore to secrecy, and nobody knew what was going on in that room. And so the Constitution is really a lot of his words. And so he is often known as the father of the US Constitution. So please be sure to fill that in. So writing a constitution is not an easy thing. And here's what occurs. 55 delegates from 12 states met for the convention. Okay, just some facts. So only 55 people were going to decide the fate of the nation. All were white, all were male, and most were college educated. The delegates were wealthier than the average American, and a large number were lawyers. So when people ask questions like, why didn't they get rid of slavery? Why didn't they give women's rights? Well, look at the room. It's all men. And for a long time, men are going to be making those decisions. So it's going to be very difficult to make big changes like that. So the major issues that we are going to see. Question number one is, how do you meet the needs of both small states and large states? Because we're going to find out very soon that small states and large states have a totally different view of how the government should look. Also, how do you meet the needs of slaveholding states and non-slave holding states? So once we figure out the small state, large state part, we will then have to deal with what about states that have slaves and states that don't have slaves? And here's one of the major issues. It's the idea of representation. And so when we talk about representation, one of the key things is that you have people like this person here who speaks for the group. And the big idea is going to be how many representatives will each state get and how will we decide that? Because remember, no taxation without representation. Now every state's going to have a voice in the government. The question is, how many will each state have? All right, now we're going to get to the debate. You're going to see a preview of one of the big disagreements that they're going to have, and it's the large state, small state issue. So on page 2 of your notes, there's a section called video notes. You're going to write down, just like last time, at least 2 items from this section. Okay, and it's only about 1 minute and 29 seconds, so there's not a lot of information in here, but it gives you a preview of some of the disagreements that sides will have in creating the Constitution.
Smaller states, which had enjoyed equal representation in the existing government, feared they would lose sovereignty to the dominance of the larger states. Delaware's Gunning Bedford warned that the small states would find some foreign ally if their autonomy was threatened. The larger states wanted representation based on population. James Wilson reminded the delegates, "Can we forget for whom we are forming a government? Is it for men or for the imaginary beings called states?" As the debate went on, 2 delegates from New York walked out, believing the convention had exceeded its mandate. If others left, the convention might collapse. Overseeing the debate, Washington grew anxious for a solution. Then Roger Sherman of Connecticut arrived with a proposal. It would come to be known as the Great Compromise. Sherman proposed a legislature split into 2 bodies. One would allocate representatives based on a state's population. The other would treat states as equals. Here was the birth of the House of Representatives and Senate. The Great Compromise broke the deadlock between large and small states, but left them with a new, troubling question.
All right. So let me go back to full screen here. Hopefully you wrote down a few things there, but you see that the debate is going to be between small states and large states. So let's go ahead and go through it. So let's continue with our notes. Remember, the things in yellow are the things that you're going to be writing down. So issue number one, big states versus small states. And when we say big states and small states, it has nothing to do with the actual size of the state on a map. What it has to do with is the population of the state. So the large states are the more populated states, and the less populated states have less people. So the more populated states were led by states like Virginia. So you'll hear something called a Virginia plan in a second. And then the less populated states were led by New Jersey. And we'll often call it the New Jersey plan, and they have a different view. And here's the conflict they had. If you're going to send representatives to Congress to make laws, and all 13 states are going to do it, you have to think about what each side will want. States with a lot of people and states with less people. So on your sheet, you have the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And so probably on the Virginia plan, what I would write is, let me grab the pen here, is I would write, this is the big state plan. So I'll write big here. And for the New Jersey plan, it's the small state. So I would add this in. I'd probably highlight it. So just remember, Virginia was the first colony. It had time to grow its population. And so the key difference is right here in the middle. And I would go ahead and circle or highlight representation. The big states said that it should be based on population. Higher population means you get to send more representatives to the government. The small states had a different view. They said it's not fair, so they said it should be equal. So no matter what your size, you send the same number. So there are some views from both sides. So let me clear the writing here before I go on to the next slide. And if it's a little tough to read, go ahead and rewrite it on your page so that you can read it. So we're going to have a little opportunity to turn and talk. And so teacher may want to pause the video here. So how should we determine how many representatives a state receives? I want you to think about this. Should it be that a state with a higher population gets more representatives? So let's say Virginia has more people and they get to send 20. A state that's smaller like Rhode Island, only gets to send 2 to make laws. Or should it be equal, meaning every state receives the same number no matter what? So if every state got 2 representatives, which one is the way that we should determine? So good time to pause the video here, have people discuss which is the better method, which is more fair. All right, now they're going to have a compromise. And remember, with a compromise, 2 sides are going to make an agreement. Usually they have to give up something to meet in the middle. Now, this is not just any compromise. It's often called the Great Compromise. And the compromise that they made is still in effect today. So let's talk about it. So you have some different parts of this. So we're going to fill out the top part first. So a compromise is an agreement where each side settled something accepted rather than wanted. Okay, so they're going to meet in the middle. And so the Great Compromise is this. Basically, both sides are going to win. A compromise between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, so small states and big states. And here's what the plan said. Congress would have 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So when we say laws are made, there's actually 2 different places where they're made. All laws need the approval of both houses of Congress. So I'm going to give you a moment to draw out what this means. So Congress is the place where laws are made. And on one side of Congress, we call it the Senate. And the Senate is for the small states. Senate, small states, both start with S. And in the Senate, every state gets 2 senators. So even in today's world, the largest states still get 2. So back then there were 13 states. There would have been 26 senators, 2 from every state. Now I'll grab the pen tool here. Now the other side is the House of Representatives, a much bigger group of people, and the number of representatives they had depends on the population. So a state like Virginia would get a lot more representatives in the House of Representatives, and a state like Rhode Island would get much less. So give you a moment to write that. So just keep in mind, Congress still has a Senate and a House of Representatives. So if you look at your page, we're on page 3 now, it talks about a bicameral legislature. And this is what we have in the United States. Congress is where the laws are made, but it's not just one group, it's actually 2 groups. And when you see the word bicameral, the key part is the prefix bi. All right, bi means 2, like bicycle, 2 tires. So let's talk about what this means. So what you're going to do right now is you're going to go ahead, it says on your notes that you're going to draw a picture and label. So I want you to label something like Congress, and off of it, branch off of it 2 places, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I'll go ahead and write something that you can add. Remember that the Senate is equal. Everybody gets the same number. House of Representatives, I'll put pop. It's based off of population. Tough to draw with a mouse. So there are some helpful hints, and I like to have these ways to remember things. So here's how I remember it. The Senate starts with the letter S, and I just remember, 1, it's the shorter word. So there are less people in the Senate. Senate, same number from each state. So in today's world, everybody gets 2 senators. So I'll go ahead and write that down. Everybody gets 2. The House of Representatives is much bigger because it's based off of population. And here's how I remember it. 1, it's the longer term. House of Representatives is a longer word, more people. And I remember House of Representatives starts with an letter H. House of Representatives has more from big states. So it's based off of population. So you may want to pause the video right now so kids can go ahead and copy these helpful hints. Okay, you want something on your paper that helps you understand these concepts. All right, I'm going to clear this off. All right, so now that they've figured out this great compromise, we know how we're going to make laws. We're going to have a place where it's all equal and a place where it's based off of population. Then there came the next debate, and it had to do with how do you figure out the population of the state? Because some states have slaves, and those states wanted to use the slaves in their count. So this is about a 2-minute segment, just like the other parts. Write down at least 2 items from this segment of the video.
The next challenge: how would enslaved people be counted for purposes of representation and taxation? In 1787, slavery existed in every state except Massachusetts. But the institution was most heavily concentrated on the plantations and farms of the southern states. This painful reality raised the question of how should states determine population. More to the point, who counts as a person? The southern state delegations, led by Charles Pinckney and Pierce Butler, sought to have slaves counted as part of their population. even though they were considered to be property by their owners. The Southern delegates threatened to oppose any actions that would limit or constrain slavery.
In the extreme to the Protestant.
Some Northern delegates were incredulous. Once again, faced with the threat of a mass defection and a doomed convention, the delegates reached yet another compromise. They agreed to count all slaves, for purposes of representation, as 3/5 of a person. Looking back through time, this 3/5 decision looks like a moral failure. But to the delegates, many who assumed that slavery was already fading away, this compromise was deemed necessary if the Constitutional Convention was to have any chance of success. Of course, what the delegates could not see is that this new Constitution left millions in bondage and failed to extinguish the slow fuse that would ignite in bloody civil war 70 years later.
All right, let me go to full screen here. So let's talk about how they dealt with the issue of slavery. So this has nothing to do with ending slavery. But issue number 2, it's there in yellow, write it down on your sheet, is should slaves count in the population? Remember what the video said. Slaves were property. Should property be counted as people when counting representatives? All right, so let's take a look. You'll need to add something to there. So it was a difference between not big states and small states, northern states and southern states. So northern states prohibited, they were against slavery. They said, don't count the slaves. Southern states allowed slavery, and they said to count the slaves. And we'll see how much of a difference that can make. Because remember, if your population is higher, you get more representatives in the House of Representatives. So in terms of representatives in Congress, what will each side want? Okay, so the southern states are going to want to count them. The northern states will not. So let's take a look at this map just to get an idea of how this is going to affect the population. Let me grab the pen tool. And so if you notice, this is a population density of slaves in 1790 around the time of this. So if you see anything in red or orange, that means it's a high number of slaves. So look at the areas. If you count slaves in the population, states like Virginia, states like North Carolina, South Carolina are going to get a huge boost in their population if slaves are counted. That's why they wanted to count them. The northern states don't really have, they're under 10%. They're not really going to be helped by adding that to the population, which means they're going to have less influence in our government. All right, take a look at these states. Now, this is probably a little easier if I'm actually in the room, but we want to look at how including or excluding the slaves in the population affects representation. So I'm going to look right here at the state with the highest number of slaves. Or actually, well, that's already Virginia. Let's take a look at a state like North Carolina. So it has 100,000 slaves. So if you change the population, you're going to add these two together. You're going to count the total population plus your slave population. Okay, so look at these states. The ones with higher slave counts, you see how much of a difference they can make when you add a couple 100,000 slaves to the count. So that means there has to be some sort of compromise to make this work. Okay, so it's time to compromise, but again, and so this is an interesting one that's going to carry a legacy, and it is called the 3/5 compromise. We saw it on our preview. And here's what they said. The northern states and the southern states compromised on how slaves should be counted in terms of population. Okay, it had nothing to do with changing the rights of slaves. It just had to do with what do we do with the head count of actual people that are enslaved in a particular state. And so what they decided, and you're going to add this to your sheet, is that the states compromised by agreeing to count every 5 slaves as 3 free persons for both taxation and representation. So what the North got was if the southern states added the slaves, they had to pay more in taxes, but they increased their population. So if a state had 5,000 slaves, they would get to count 3,000 to their population. And so that was a pretty big boost for the South. So that's what the Three-Fifths Compromise. So we talked about the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. All right. Now, you're going to receive an exit ticket, a small piece of paper, and I want you to answer this question. Now, you'll turn in the exit ticket on your way out, so you're going to want to make sure your name is on it because I'll be checking those when I return. And here's my question. The Three-Fifths Compromise addressed slavery in terms of representation, but it didn't end slavery. So, how will the slavery issue affect America in the next century? So, this is the 1700s, and slavery will still be around 80 years later. So, what I want you to respond to on the small piece of paper exit ticket, make sure your name's on it, is how will the slavery issue affect America in the next century? So, I'll have you work on that. Now, I will be back tomorrow. There could be an open note quiz based on the notes you took today. But I also want to let you know that if there is time remaining, you're going to log into Schoology and you're going to work on the Blue-Kit review to go over the concepts of this week. All right. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you when I return. Take care, everybody.